They looked at me and saw an easy target, a soft, overweight accountant who spent her evenings stress-baking and her days hiding behind towering stacks of financial records. In their eyes, my size equated to weakness. I was just the heavy-set girl you could push around the one who would cry if you raised your voice. They thought my silence was submission. They thought my curves made me slow, clumsy, and entirely defenseless. But they made a fatal miscalculation, because the night the city's most dangerous men tried to silence me in that dimly lit parking garage, the head of the Rossi crime family didn't witness a victim begging for her life. He witnessed a predator waking up. In the cutthroat financial district of Chicago, invisibility is a rare commodity, but for Penelope Hastings, it was a daily reality. At 28, Penelope, or Penny, to the few people who bothered to learn her name, was a senior forensic auditor for Sterling and Hayes, one of the most prestigious accounting firms in the Midwest. She was brilliant, methodical, and possessed a mind, like a steel trap. But in the sleek glass-paneled hallways of corporate America, none of that was what people saw first. They saw her weight. Penny was a size 20. In a world of razor-thin executives and tailored designer suits, her body was an anomaly that people either judged or actively ignored. She was accustomed to the subtle microaggressions, the eyes that darted to her waistline before making eye contact, the condescending smiles from junior partners who assumed she was just a secretary, and the unsolicited health advice from colleagues who masked their cruelty as concern. She had learned early on that society equates physical softness with mental fragility. They assumed she was jolly maternal and entirely harmless. Penny used their prejudice as a weapon. While they were busy underestimating her, she was dissecting their lives. Her life took a sharp, dangerous turn in the blistering cold of November 2024. Sterling and Hayes had been retained by a sprawling logistics and import empire called Harbor Freight Solutions. On paper, it was a massive conglomerate, handling shipping routes across the Great Lakes and the eastern seaboard. In reality, as whispered in the hushed, terrified conversations of the city's elite, it was the legitimate front for the Rossi family, a modern, sophisticated syndicate that had evolved from street-level racketeering into white-collar dominance. The head of this empire was Gabriel Rossi. Gabriel was 34, impeccably dressed, and possessed the kind of quiet, terrifying authority that made rooms fall silent the moment he entered. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just looked at you, and you understood exactly what would happen if you crossed him. When Penny was assigned to lead the audit team at Harbor Freight's sprawling headquarters in the South Loop, her boss, William O'Keefe, had been visibly nervous. "Just stick to the numbers," Penelope O'Keefe had stuttered, wiping sweat from his forehead, despite the office's aggressive air conditioning. "Don't ask questions about the operational side. Don't look into the warehouse manifests unless they explicitly offer them. Audit the corporate accounts, stamp the approval, and get out." Penny had simply nodded, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses. But she wasn't one to do a job halfway. Her first week at Harbor Freight was a masterclass in being ignored. The building was filled with imposing, broad-shouldered men in tailored suits who walked with a predatory grace. When Penny rolled her heavy cart of files down the hallway, her thighs brushing together, the men would part, not out of respect, but with a thinly veiled dismissal. Just the fat accountant, their eyes seemed to say. Nothing to worry about. Gabriel Rossi was a ghost for the first 3 days. Penny worked out of a windowless conference room in the basement, surrounded by bankers' boxes. It wasn't until Thursday that she finally crossed paths with the boss. She was struggling to carry 3 heavily overstuffed binders from the elevator to her makeshift office. The weight was immense, but beneath her soft exterior years of hauling heavy boxes and a quiet dedication to powerlifting in her cramped apartment had given her profound functional strength. As she rounded a corner, a tall figure stepped directly into her path. It was Gabriel. His dark, tailored suit seemed to absorb the fluorescent light. Beside him was his underboss, a slick, sharply dressed man named Thomas Reed. "Watch your step, sweetheart." Thomas sneered, stepping back as if Penny's size might somehow infect him. "We wouldn't want you to trip and cause an earthquake. Might damage the servers." Penny paused. The insult was incredibly crude, the kind of cheap shot she had endured since middle school. She felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the heat rising in her cheeks. But she didn't look down. She adjusted her grip on the 80 pounds of paper in her arms, her breathing perfectly steady. Gabriel didn't laugh at his underboss's joke. In fact, his dark, piercing eyes snapped from Thomas to Penny. He noted her flushed cheeks, but he also noted something else, the massive, heavy binders that would have strained a grown man, which she was holding with absolute, unyielding stability. "Are you the lead auditor?" Gabriel asked, his voice, a low, gravelly baritone that sent a strange shiver down her spine. "Yes, Mr. Rossi. Penelope Hastings," she replied, her voice calm and professional. "Do you require assistance with those?" he asked, a genuine flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "No, thank you," Penny said, holding his gaze for a fraction of a second longer than was polite before shifting her eyes back to the hallway. "I'm perfectly capable of carrying my own weight." It was a subtle double entendre, and for a fleeting moment, the corner of Gabriel's mouth twitched upward. He stepped aside, allowing her to pass. As she walked away, Thomas scoffed quietly. Why did O'Keefe send her? She looks like she's going to have a heart attack just walking to the vending machine. "Watch your mouth, Thomas." Gabriel's voice echoed down the hall, suddenly devoid of any warmth. "She's here to make sure the feds don't look closer at our books. I don't care what she looks like, as long as she does her job." Penny heard it all. They thought she was just a number cruncher, a soft, vulnerable woman. They had absolutely no idea the kind of storm she was about to unleash on their meticulously organized empire. By her third week, Penny had practically memorized the financial architecture of Harbor Freight Solutions, and what she found was terrifying. She was a forensic auditor. Her job wasn't just to add up columns, it was to find the story the numbers were trying to hide. And the story hidden deep within the encrypted ledgers of the company's miscellaneous logistics division was a tale of massive, brazen theft. Someone was siphoning money out of Gabriel Rossi's pockets. It wasn't a clumsy smash and grab. It was an incredibly sophisticated embezzlement ring. Over $12 million had been bled out of the company over the past 18 months, filtered through a labyrinth of phantom vendors, inflated invoices, and offshore shell companies based in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. It was brilliant. But Penny was better. Sitting in her basement office at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday, surrounded by empty coffee cups and half-eaten protein bars, Penny finally connected the final dot. She stared at the screen, her heart hammering against her ribs. The phantom vendor authorizing the fraudulent invoices was a company called Apex Maritime Solutions, and the digital signature authorizing the payments from Harbor Freight belonged to Thomas Reed. The slick, condescending underboss who had mocked her weight was stealing from the most dangerous man in Chicago. A cold sweat broke out across Penny's back. This was no longer white-collar crime. This was mafia treason. If she reported this to William O'Keefe, her boss would likely bury it, terrified of retaliation. If she went to the police, she would be dragged into a federal racketeering case and likely end up at the bottom of Lake Michigan. And if she went directly to Gabriel Rossi, she had no guarantee he wouldn't just shoot the messenger to keep the family's embarrassing internal leaks quiet. She needed airtight, undeniable proof, hard copies of the routing numbers. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the office shifted. Penny noticed it immediately. The predator's intuition she had developed over years of being a target kicked in. People were watching her, specifically Thomas Reed's men. On Thursday afternoon, Thomas himself strolled into her windowless office uninvited. He shut the door behind him with a quiet, ominous click. He was carrying a pink pastry box from a high-end local bakery. "Penelope," Thomas said, offering a smile that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. "Working hard, I see. I brought you a little something. Figured you must be getting hungry down here all by yourself. A woman with your appetite needs fuel, right?" He slid the box across the desk. Inside were half a dozen gourmet cupcakes. The insult was blatant, designed to humiliate her, to reduce her back to the fat girl stereotype, to make her feel small and weak. "Thank you, Mr. Reed," Penny said, keeping her voice devoid of emotion. She didn't touch the box. Thomas leaned across her desk, planting his palms on the wood. The smell of his expensive cologne was overpowering. "I hear you've been requesting access to the legacy servers, the old shipping manifests from last year." Penny's pulse spiked, but her face remained a mask of bland corporate indifference. "Standard procedure for a full-scope audit. I need to establish a baseline for year-over-year revenue." Thomas leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, grating whisper. "Let me give you some advice, sweetheart. You're a nice girl, a little soft around the edges. You don't belong in the deep water. You just stamp the primary accounts, collect your firm's fat paycheck, and you go back to baking cookies or whatever it is you do on weekends. You start digging into old manifests, you might find something you can't unsee. And in this business, accidents happen. Heavy boxes fall. People trip down stairs. With your lack of agility, that would be a tragedy." It was a direct threat. He knew she was getting close. "I appreciate your concern for my safety," Penny said evenly, locking eyes with him. She refused to break contact. "But I assure you my footing is very secure." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, a muscle ticking in his jaw. He clearly hadn't expected pushback. He expected tears or stammering apologies. Finally, he sneered, standing up straight. "Eat the cupcakes, Penelope. Enjoy the sugar. Because this audit wraps up by Friday. Understand?" He turned and walked out. Penny waited until the footsteps faded down the hall before she let out a shaky breath. Her hands were trembling slightly, but beneath the fear, a slow, hot anger began to boil. For her entire life, men like Thomas had looked at her and seen a victim. They thought her body made her a target. They thought her size meant she couldn't fight back. Friday, she thought. I have until tomorrow night. She needed to get into the physical archive room on the 4th floor. The digital files had been scrubbed, but a company this old still kept physical hard copies of the wire transfer authorizations locked in filing cabinets for federal tax compliance. The proof she needed to show Gabriel Rossi the undeniable paper trail that would save her own life and expose Thomas was up there. She decided to make her move on Friday night after the building had cleared out for the weekend. It was a terrifying gamble, but Penelope Hastings was done being treated like she was invisible. Friday night brought a torrential downpour to Chicago. The rain lashed against the heavy tinted windows of the Harbor Freight Building, drowning out the sounds of the city. By 10 p.m., the corporate offices were deserted. Only a skeleton crew of security guards remained, mostly patrolling the ground floor and the warehouse docks. Penny sat in her basement office, the lights dimmed. She wore dark jeans, a loose black sweater, and heavy rubber-soled boots. She checked her watch, 10:15 p.m. It was time. She bypassed the elevators knowing they required keycard swipes that would log her movements. Instead, she took the concrete stairwell. Climbing 4 flights of stairs would have left the old her gasping for air, but the powerlifting and cardiovascular endurance she had quietly built up over the years served her well. She arrived at the fourth-floor landing, breathing slightly heavier, but completely energized. The archive room was at the end of a long, dark corridor. It was a massive, cavernous space, filled with row after row of rolling, heavy-duty steel shelving units, operated by mechanical cranks. The air smelled of old paper and dust. Penny slipped inside, using a master key she had copied from the maintenance staff's board a week prior. She clicked on a small, high-powered tactical flashlight, shielding the beam with her hand. Section G. 2023 Wire Authorizations. She moved swiftly through the aisles, turning the heavy metal cranks to part the massive shelving units. The physical exertion required to move tons of paper on steel tracks was significant, but Penny handled it with ease. She found the cabinet picked the cheap standard-issue lock with 2 paper clips, a skill she had learned out of sheer boredom in college, and began rifling through the folders. Bingo. There it was. A thick file labeled Apex Maritime, Dispersal Drafts. She opened it and shone her light on the documents. Thomas Reed's actual physical signature was on every single fraudulent wire transfer, signed in blue ink, alongside the bank routing numbers for the Cayman accounts. It was the smoking gun. She quickly stuffed the file into her leather messenger bag. Then she heard it. The unmistakable squeak of a wet rubber sole on the linoleum floor outside the archive room. Penny froze instantly, killing her flashlight. The archives plunged into absolute darkness. "She's in here." A rough, grating voice echoed through the massive room. I saw the stairwell door closing. It wasn't Thomas. It was 2 men. Penny recognized the voice. It was Mickey, one of Thomas Reed's personal enforcers, a massive, steroid-injected thug with a reputation for brutality. "Thomas said not to leave a mess," a second voice replied. Sullivan Barnes, lean, wiry, and fast. "Make it look like a heart attack or a fall. Just get the files back from the fat bitch and let's get out of here. I hate the smell of this room." Penny's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was trapped on the 4th floor with 2 mafia hitters who had orders to kill her. The fear was cold and paralyzing, threatening to lock her muscles. "They see you as weak," a voice whispered in her head. "Use it." She was standing in the aisle between 2 massive rolling steel shelves. The gap was only about 3 feet wide. "Spread out," Mickey ordered. "Find her." Penny slowly backed away, her silent footsteps masked by the thunder outside. She moved toward the back wall where the shadows were absolute. She reached into her bag and pulled out the only weapon she had, a heavy stainless steel thermos filled with hot coffee and her tactical, steel-cased flashlight. It wasn't much against guns, but in close quarters in the dark, she knew physics. A beam of light swept down the aisle next to hers. Sullivan was getting closer. "Come out, Penelope," Sullivan mocked, his voice echoing eerily. "We got some cupcakes for you. Come on out, piggy." The rage that surged through Penny at that word was volcanic. Decades of being mocked, belittled, pushed aside, and underestimated coalesced into a sharp, crystalline focus. She wasn't just an accountant anymore. She was a woman fighting for her life. Sullivan turned the corner into her aisle. His flashlight beam swept across the floor, illuminating her boots. "Gotcha," he started to say, raising his silenced pistol. He never finished the sentence. Penny didn't scream or cower. Using the tight confines of the aisle, she lunged forward with terrifying speed, her mass and momentum turning her into a human battering ram. She slammed her shoulder directly into Sullivan's chest. The impact was devastating. A man might expect a woman of her size to be slow, but force equals mass times acceleration. Sullivan was launched backward, the air exploding from his lungs. His gun flew from his hand, clattering into the darkness. Before he could even hit the ground, Penny brought the heavy stainless steel thermos down in a brutal, sweeping arc, connecting solidly with the side of his skull. There was a sickening crack, and Sullivan collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut instantly unconscious. "Sully!" Mickey's voice rang out from 2 aisles over a note of confusion replacing his bravado. "Sully, talk to me." Penny didn't hesitate. She grabbed the mechanical crank wheel on the end of the steel shelving unit next to her. These units weighed thousands of pounds when fully loaded. She knew Mickey was in the adjacent aisle. Planting her heavy boots against the floor, she engaged her core, her powerful legs and her back. Muscles that had been hidden beneath soft curves roared to life. With a guttural grunt, she threw her entire body weight into the crank, spinning it violently. The massive steel shelf lurched forward on its tracks, rolling rapidly toward the unit next to it, closing the aisle Mickey was standing in. "What the—" Mickey yelled, as the walls began to close in on him. He scrambled to get out, but he was too big, too slow. With a deafening clang, the 2 heavy steel units slammed together, pinning Mickey between them. He screamed in pain as the metal crushed his ribs, dropping his weapon. He was trapped, immobilized by tons of paper and steel. Penny stood at the end of the aisle chest, heaving the steel flashlight gripped tightly in her hand. She had taken down 2 seasoned Mafia enforcers in under 45 seconds without firing a single shot. Suddenly, the main overhead fluorescent lights flickered on blindingly bright. Penny spun around, raising her flashlight like a club ready to fight the next wave. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright hallway, was Gabriel Rossi. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket. His tie was loosened, and he held a matte black automatic pistol in his right hand, lowered by his side. He had clearly heard the commotion and come up to investigate. Gabriel's eyes swept the room. He saw Sullivan Barnes bleeding and unconscious on the floor. He saw Mickey, a towering brute of a man, wedged and groaning pitifully between the steel shelves. And then his dark, calculating gaze locked onto Penelope. She stood there breathing heavily, her hair out of its neat bun and falling around her shoulders. She looked wild, powerful, and absolutely lethal. For a long moment, the only sound was the rain lashing against the windows and Mickey's pathetic whimpering. Gabriel looked at the heavy thermos, the dented steel flashlight, and the massive shelving unit she had moved with pure physical force. The boss of the Rossi syndicate, a man who had seen every kind of violence the underworld had to offer, stood absolutely motionless. The shock on his face slowly melted away, replaced by an expression Penny had never in her entire life seen directed at her by a man. It wasn't pity. It wasn't dismissal. It was profound, overwhelming awe. "You." Gabriel breathed, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying across the room. He slowly holstered his weapon, never taking his eyes off her flushed, defiant face. "Who exactly are you, Penelope?" Penny straightened her back, adjusting her grip on her leather bag containing the files. She looked the most dangerous man in the city, dead in the eye, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible at all. "I'm your auditor, Mr. Rossi," she said, her voice steady and ringing with newfound authority. "And we need to talk about your balance sheets." The silence in the archive room was absolute, save for the rhythmic drumming of the storm against the reinforced glass and the ragged, wet breathing of Mickey, who was still pinned between the steel shelves. Gabriel Rossi didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying, deliberate grace of a predator, assessing a new, entirely unfamiliar variable in its territory. He stepped over the unconscious, bleeding form of Sullivan Barnes, kicking the suppressed pistol down the aisle out of reach. He walked until he was barely 3 feet from Penelope. Up close, the contrast between them was stark. Gabriel was sharp edges and tailored Italian wool, a man carved from cold marble. Penelope was soft curves, disheveled hair, and a heavy knit sweater radiating an intense, almost feral heat. She didn't shrink under his gaze. She didn't attempt to make herself smaller, a habit Gabriel had observed in nearly everyone else who stood before him. She planted her heavy boots firmly on the linoleum, her posture anchoring her to the ground like an ancient oak tree. "My balance sheets," Gabriel repeated softly, the gravel in his voice vibrating in the quiet room. He looked at the dented steel thermos in her hand. "You nearly decapitated one of my best enforcers with a coffee container to talk about my balance sheets." "He was trying to shoot me, mister," Rossi Penny replied, her voice trembling just slightly with residual adrenaline, but her eyes remaining locked on his. "And I don't drink coffee. It was Earl Grey tea. Now are you going to help me get your underboss's treason out of this building, or are you going to let him keep stealing from you?" Gabriel's eyes narrowed infinitesimally. Thomas Reed." Penny confirmed, unzipping her leather messenger bag and pulling out the thick Apex Maritime file. "He's been bleeding your logistics division dry. $12 million over 18 months. Offshore accounts in the Caymans routed through a nested LLC structure in Cyprus. I found the digital footprint on Tuesday. These," she tapped the manila folder, "are the physical wire transfer slips with his signature. He knew I was getting close. He sent these two to make sure I had an accident." Gabriel slowly reached out and took the folder. He opened it under the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. Penny watched his face carefully. She expected rage, maybe a sudden outburst of violence. Instead, his expression went completely dead. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. It was the face of a man who had just mentally condemned someone to death. He closed the folder. "We need to leave this room. Now." "What about them?" Penny gestured to the two men on the floor. "They failed, which means Thomas will know they failed the second they miss their check-in," Gabriel said, stepping past her to examine the shelving unit trapping Mickey. "He will panic. A panicked rat bites." Gabriel looked at the mechanical crank, then at Penny's arms. Beneath the soft fabric of her sweater, he could now see the sheer density of her physique. The realization of what she had done, the sheer explosive power required to move a fully loaded industrial archive shelf fast enough to trap a trained killer, shifted something profound within him. For years, Gabriel had surrounded himself with people who possessed sharp teeth but brittle bones. He had dated supermodels and socialites, women who survived on champagne and salads, who shattered at the first sign of genuine conflict. But here, standing in the dust of his basement, was a woman the world had dismissed as weak, simply because she carried extra weight, and she had just single-handedly dismantled a two-man hit squad, using nothing but her intellect and her raw functional strength. "You're a remarkable woman, Penelope Hastings," Gabriel murmured almost to himself. "I'm an accountant who lifts heavy things, so my back doesn't hurt when I sit at a desk all day." Penny corrected him sharply, though a sudden flush rose to her cheeks at the compliment. "We need to go. If Thomas controls the security detail tonight, the elevators and standard exits are compromised." "Agreed," Gabriel said. He pulled a sleek radio from his belt. "Jackson, it's Gabriel. Initiate Protocol Black. I'm moving to the freight elevator in the rear loading dock. Bring the armored SUV. We have a traitor in the house." "Copy that, boss," a crackling voice replied. Gabriel turned to Penny. "Follow me. Stay close. And Penelope?" She paused, hoisting her heavy bag over her shoulder. "Yes." He offered a ghost of a smile, cold and thrilling. "Keep the thermos handy." Their descent was a tense, silent sprint through the service corridors of the harbor freight building. Gabriel moved fluidly, clearing corners with his weapon drawn, while Penny kept pace right behind him. She was breathing hard, her thick thighs burning from the relentless stair climbing, but she didn't ask him to slow down. her stamina forged in hours of grueling gym sessions held firm. They burst into the rear loading dock, just as a massive black, up-armored Cadillac Escalade screeched to a halt on the wet concrete. The rain was torrential now, a blinding sheet of water. The driver's side door flew open, and a towering man with military cropped hair and a tactical vest stepped out, aiming an assault rifle into the shadows. This was Jackson Hayes Gabriel's head of security. "Clear!" Jackson shouted over the thunder. "Get in!" Gabriel ordered Penny, shielding her from the rain as he shoved her into the spacious back seat before climbing in beside her. The doors slammed shut, sealing them in a soundproof leather-lined vault. "Where to, boss?" Jackson asked, throwing the massive vehicle into gear and tearing out of the loading bay onto the flooded streets of Lower Wacker Drive. "The St. Regis penthouse," Gabriel said, his eyes scanning the dark, wet city through the tinted windows. "Call Matteo, tell him to meet us there, and tell him to bring the Gallagher files. Thomas isn't just stealing to retire, he's funding a war." Penny sat back against the leather, her heart finally beginning to slow. She looked at Gabriel. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, stark reality. She was riding in an armored car with a mafia boss, actively hunting his treasonous underboss. Gabriel turned his head, catching her stare. The aggressive neon lights of the city washed over his face. "Are you all right?" Penny looked down at her hands. Her knuckles were bruised and slightly swollen from where she had gripped the thermos, but they were remarkably steady. "I'm fine, but I'm going to need a computer, a secure internet connection, and 3 monitors when we get to wherever we are going." Gabriel let out a low, genuine laugh that seemed to surprise even himself. It was a rich, warm sound that filled the cabin. "You just survived an assassination attempt, Penelope, and your first request is a multi-monitor workstation. Thomas Reed thought I was just a fat, invisible number cruncher." Penny said, her jaw tightening, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous, deeply buried pride. "He thought I was weak. I'm going to financially dissect him, Mr. Rossi. I'm going to find every dime he stole, freeze every shell account he opened, and leave him with absolutely nothing before the sun comes up." Gabriel looked at her, his dark eyes trailing over the solid, unyielding lines of her body, before meeting her fierce, intelligent gaze. The respect in his eyes was absolute. "I don't doubt that for a second," Gabriel said softly. "But please, call me Gabriel." The penthouse at the St. Regis was a sprawling, brutalist masterpiece, suspended 80 stories above the Chicago skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the storm raging over Lake Michigan, lightning fracturing the black sky in jagged streaks. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, smelling of expensive espresso and impending violence. Penny had commandeered the massive black marble dining table. True to his word, Gabriel had Jackson procure 3 high-end monitors, a secure laptop, and a dedicated encrypted server connection. For the past 2 hours, Penny had been a blur of motion, her thick, capable fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with terrifying speed. Standing on the opposite side of the table were Gabriel and his consigliere Matteo Russo, a silver-haired, elegantly dressed man in his late 50s who looked like a distinguished college professor, but possessed the ruthless cunning of a cartel lawyer. "This is impossible," Matteo was saying, pacing the length of the room, looking at the complex data maps Penny had thrown onto the largest monitor. "Thomas has been with the family for 12 years. He wouldn't be stupid enough to wire funds directly into a domestic account." "He didn't," Penny said without looking up from her screen. "He's smart, but he's arrogant. He assumed no one would ever look past the initial Cayman Island transfers. He set up a blind trust in Cyprus to wash the money, but he made a critical error in his forex conversions. He moved the money in blocks of exactly 400,000 euros to avoid automated banking flags." She hit a key, and a dizzying web of financial transactions materialized on the screen. I tracked the microfluctuations in the conversion rates. Penny continued, her voice commanding the room entirely. Those exact amounts were deposited back into a regional bank in Cicero, Illinois, exactly 48 hours after they left the Caymans. The account belongs to an LLC called Ironclad Holdings. Matteo stopped pacing. The color drained from his face. He looked at Gabriel. Ironclad? That's a front for the Gallagher Syndicate. The Gallaghers were an old-school, brutal Irish mob faction controlling the South Side ports. They had been bleeding territory to the Rossi family for 5 years. He's not just stealing, Gabriel said, his voice deadly quiet. He leaned over the table, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over the monitors. He's financing our enemies. He's buying the Gallaghers the muscle and the weapons they need to hit us, and he's using my own money to do it. There's more, Penny said, finally pushing her glasses up her nose and looking at Gabriel. The sheer intensity of her intellect was magnetic. Gabriel found himself entirely captivated, not just by what she was saying, but by how she said it, with absolute, unshakable certainty. I breached the Ironclad Holdings account using a back door in their payroll software. $2 million was wired out 3 hours ago to a private maritime logistics contractor. A contractor? Jackson asked from the doorway, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. For what? A shipment. Penny brought up a digitized shipping manifest, a cargo vessel called the Northern Star. It bypassed standard customs checks using Harbor Freight's Platinum Clearance Thomas authorized. It's scheduled to dock at Pier 39 in exactly an hour and a half. Weapons, Matteo breathed. Military grade if they're bypassing customs with a $2 million transport fee. If the Gallaghers get their hands on that shipment tonight, they'll have enough firepower to wipe out half our operations by morning. The room plunged into a suffocating silence. The reality of the betrayal was staggering. Thomas had orchestrated a masterstroke. He had used Gabriel's infrastructure, his money, and his clearance to arm his worst enemies. Gabriel stood up straight, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped. He looked at his men. Jackson, call in every hitter we have on standby. Arm them heavy. Matteo, get the mayor's police liaison on the phone and tell him to keep all squad cars out of the Pier 39 district until sunrise. We handle this in-house. Gabriel, it's a fortress down there, Matteo warned. If Thomas is overseeing the drop, he'll have a dozen Gallagher shooters with him. We need time to strategize. We don't have time. Gabriel snarled the mask of the civilized businessman, finally slipping to reveal the ruthless mafia boss beneath. If that cargo comes off the boat, the city burns. Gabriel turned to Penny. She was watching him, her dark eyes wide, but entirely unafraid. She had just handed him the keys to his own survival. Penelope. Gabriel said, his voice softening just a fraction as he spoke to her. He walked around the heavy marble table until he was standing directly in front of her. He was tall, dominating, but Penny didn't shrink back. She stood up to meet him. Even in her heavy boots, he was taller, but their presence in the room was entirely equal. You've done more for this family tonight than men who have sworn blood oaths to me. Gabriel said, his gaze dropping briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. The air between them suddenly felt thick, charged with a strange magnetic electricity. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a deep, primal recognition. He saw her. All of her. The brilliant mind, the fierce spirit, and the soft, powerful body that had saved her own life. I need you to stay here, Gabriel told her gently. Jackson will leave 2 men at the door. You'll be safe. When this is over, you name your price. Whatever you want, it's yours. Penny looked at the tactical map on her screen, then back at Gabriel. She shook her head. I'm not staying here. Gabriel frowned. Penelope, this isn't an audit anymore. We are going into a live firefight against heavy artillery. It's not a place for you." "It's exactly the place for me," Penny countered, crossing her arms over her chest. Thomas used the legacy encryption codes from the 2021 Harbor Freight system to lock the digital manifest of the cargo containers. Those containers are biometric and digitally sealed. If you don't have the master decryption key, you can't open them to verify the weapons, and you can't lock them down to prevent the Gallaghers from moving them. "We can blow the hinges," Jackson suggested gruffly. "They're maritime-grade titanium," Penny shot back, glancing at the security chief. "It would take hours with a plasma torch, time you just admitted you don't have." She turned back to Gabriel, her expression resolute. "I have the decryption key on this laptop. I can bypass the locks in 60 seconds. You need me on that pier, Gabriel." Matteo looked horrified. "Boss, you can't bring a civilian and accountant into a war zone." Gabriel didn't look at Matteo. He was staring at Penelope. He saw the stubborn jut of her chin, the way she planted her feet. She was fully aware of the danger. She knew exactly what she was walking into, but she wasn't hiding behind her desk anymore. She was stepping into the fire. He realized then that he had made the same mistake as Thomas, as William O'Keefe, as the rest of the world. He had tried to put her in a box marked fragile. He had tried to protect her because society dictated that women who looked like her needed protecting. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "Pack up the laptop, Penelope," Gabriel said softly, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Gabriel, be reasonable," Matteo hissed. "I am being reasonable, Matteo," Gabriel said, never breaking eye contact with Penny. He reached out his large, warm hand, lightly brushing her shoulder, sending a shock wave of heat straight down her spine. "She's the smartest person in this room, and she hits harder than half your crew. If she says she can open those boxes, she comes with us." Penny felt a fierce, burning triumph ignite in her chest. She quickly unplugged the secure laptop, shoving it into her leather messenger bag. She felt the heavy weight of the steel thermos clinking against the bottom of the bag. "Let's go steal your money back," Penny said, zipping the bag closed and looking up at the most dangerous man in Chicago. Gabriel pulled a heavy tactical Kevlar vest from a duffel bag Jackson had brought in. He held it open for her. "Ladies first." The ride to Pier 39 was a masterclass in controlled chaos. The armored Escalade tore through the flooded, desolate streets of the industrial district, flanked by 3 blacked-out SUVs carrying Gabriel's most lethal enforcers. Inside the cabin, the silence was deafening. Penny adjusted the heavy Kevlar vest over her chest. It was snug, compressing her thick sweater, adding an undeniable weight to her frame that she found oddly comforting. It felt like a physical manifestation of the armor she had worn mentally her entire life. Gabriel sat beside her, checking the magazine of his customized tactical rifle. He moved with a brutal economic precision. Every so often his dark eyes would flick to her, assessing her state of mind. He found no panic. Her hands rested securely on her leather bag, her breathing steady deep, and measured the exact same breathing technique she used right before deadlifting 300 pounds. "We hit the main gate in 60 seconds, Jackson called out from the driver's seat. "Drones show the Northern Star is already docked. They've offloaded 4 primary containers onto the staging tarmac. Looks like 20 shooters on the ground. Gallagher's men." "And Thomas?" Gabriel asked, his voice a low, lethal hum. "Visual confirmed. He's standing near the central control kiosk," Jackson replied, throwing the SUV into a sharp, sliding turn that threw Penny against Gabriel's solid shoulder. He caught her effortlessly, his hand lingering on her arm for a microsecond before he gripped his weapon. "We go fast and we go loud," Gabriel ordered. "Jackson, you take the right flank. Suppress their high-ground shooters. I'm taking Penelope straight down the middle to the control kiosk. Nobody touches her. Am I understood? A chorus of grim affirmations echoed through the radio. Penelope! Gabriel turned to her, his face inches from hers. The scent of rain gun oil and his expensive cologne was intoxicating. When the doors open, you stay on my 6. You don't stop moving until we reach that kiosk. Can you run? Penny looked at him, a fierce, feral smile touching her lips. I can run right through them if I have to. The Escalade smashed through the chained chain-link gates of Pier 39 like a battering ram. The moment the tires hit the tarmac of the container yard, the night erupted in blinding muzzle flashes and deafening gunfire. Jackson threw the vehicle into a spinning park, using the armored chassis as a shield against the immediate hail of bullets from the Gallagher syndicate. Go! Gabriel roared, kicking his door open. Penny moved. She didn't hesitate. As Gabriel stepped out, laying down a punishing wave of suppressing fire that dropped 2 Gallagher men, instantly Penny slipped out behind him. The rain was a freezing horizontal sheet, slicking the concrete and blurring her vision, but she kept her eyes fixed on the broad armored back of the Mafia boss. They sprinted through the maze of towering rusted shipping containers. The noise was apocalyptic, the screaming of metal, the thunder of gunfire and the shouting of panicked men. Despite her size, Penny moved with a grounded driving force. Her legs, thick and powerful, propelled her forward like a freight train. A Gallagher shooter stepped out from an alleyway between 2 crates, raising a shotgun. Before Gabriel could pivot, Penny didn't stop. She dropped her shoulder and slammed her heavy leather bag loaded with the solid steel thermos and her laptop directly into the man's face as she ran past. He went down in a spray of blood and teeth. Gabriel glanced back, his eyes flashing with a mix of shock and pure, unadulterated pride. Good hit. Keep moving, Penny yelled over the gunfire. They reached the central control kiosk, a small glass-enclosed booth elevated above the main tarmac, directly overlooking the 4 massive titanium-reinforced cargo containers. Cover me! Penny shouted, throwing her bag onto the metal console inside the booth. Gabriel stood in the doorway, his rifle barking, as he held the perimeter against the surging Gallagher forces. Penny ripped her laptop from the bag, jamming a decryption cable into the kiosk's mainframe. Her fingers were freezing, soaked in rain and adrenaline, but her mind was a surgical instrument. She pulled up the legacy code. The screen flashed red biometric lock engaged. Access denied. They're trying to manually override the hydraulics on the ground. Gabriel yelled over his shoulder, dropping an empty magazine and slamming a fresh one home. I need those locks permanently sealed. Penelope now. 30 seconds. Penny typed furiously, bypassing the primary firewall. She routed the brute force algorithm through the back door she had found in Thomas's offshore accounts. She wasn't just guessing. She was using Thomas's own digital footprint against him. Outside, the Gallagher men were realizing that their prize was trapped. Panic was setting in. 15 seconds. 10 seconds. Override successful. Got it. Penny slammed the enter key, initiating hard lock on the titanium deadbolts and wiping the localized memory. Down on the tarmac, the massive mechanical locking mechanisms of the 4 shipping containers engaged with a thunderous, echoing clang that sounded like a prison door slamming shut. The electronic keypads on the containers sparked and went dead. The weapons were sealed inside, essentially turning the containers into 2-ton steel vaults that couldn't be opened without a blowtorch and a week of uninterrupted work. The Gallagher men, realizing their multi-million-dollar arsenal was lost, and Gabriel Rossi's heavy hitters were closing in, broke rank. They began retreating toward the perimeter fence, abandoning the cargo. Penny let out a massive breath, leaning against the console, her legs finally trembling. It's done, they're locked. The gunfire began to taper off, replaced by the shouts of Gabriel's men securing the dock. Gabriel lowered his rifle, turning toward Penny. He looked at her, his chest heaving, the rain washing the gunpowder from his face. The look in his eyes was one of sheer, unmasked reverence. "You did it." He stepped into the kiosk, reaching out to cup her face with a large, calloused hand. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. "You actually did it." Penny leaned into his touch, her heart hammering, not from fear, but from the electric heat radiating from him. "I told you I wasn't just a number cruncher." "No." A new venomous voice cut through the sound of the rain. "You're a dead woman." Gabriel spun around, raising his rifle, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Thomas Reed stepped out from the shadows beneath the kiosk's metal stairs. He was soaked, bleeding from a graze on his forehead, and gripping a heavy revolver. His slick, condescending demeanor was entirely gone, replaced by the desperate, rabid look of a cornered animal. He had lost the money, he had lost the weapons, and he knew Gabriel would skin him alive. "Drop the rifle, Gabriel." Thomas spat, aiming the revolver directly at Penny's chest. "Drop it or I blow a hole through your favorite little accountant." Gabriel froze. The ruthless mafia boss, a man who had stared down cartels and federal indictments without blinking, suddenly went entirely rigid. His eyes darted to Penny, and for the very first time, Penelope saw absolute, paralyzing terror in Gabriel Rossi's face. He was terrified for her. Slowly, carefully, Gabriel set his rifle on the metal floor and kicked it away. "Smart," Thomas sneered, moving up the short flight of steps into the kiosk. He kept his gun trained on Penny. He stepped close to her, his face twisted in disgust. "You ruined everything. A fat, pathetic nobody with a laptop. I should have thrown you out a window the day you walked into my building." Thomas reached out, grabbing Penny roughly by the shoulder, intending to pull her in front of him as a human shield so he could back out of the kiosk. It was the final, fatal manifestation of his prejudice. Thomas assumed, like every other man who had ever bullied her, that because she was a large, soft woman, she was immobile, weak, and compliant. He assumed his grip would easily move her. He was wrong. Penny planted her heavy boots onto the steel grate of the floor. She dropped her center of gravity, anchoring her mass. When Thomas yanked her shoulder, she didn't stumble forward. She stood like a stone pillar. Thomas blinked, surprised by the sudden resistance, his balance shifting forward for a split second. That was all Penny needed, channeling every ounce of frustration, every sneer, every crude joke about her weight she had ever endured. Penny pivoted violently on her heel. She reached up, wrapping her thick, powerful arms around Thomas's gun arm and his neck in a vice-like clinch. Before he could pull the trigger, she drove her hips into his side, using her core strength and the sheer, undeniable physics of her mass. She executed a flawless, devastating hip throw. Thomas let out a strangled gasp as his feet left the floor. Penny hoisted his entire body weight over her hip and slammed him face first onto the solid steel deck of the kiosk. The impact was bone-shattering. The revolver flew from his hand, skittering off the edge of the booth and plunging into the dark water of the bay below. Thomas groaned, his nose broken, completely incapacitated by the sheer kinetic force of the throw. Penny stood over him, her chest rising and falling heavily, her fists clenched. "I am not pathetic," she growled, her voice a low, terrifying rumble. "And I am not weak." Gabriel stared at the scene, utterly spellbound. He looked at Thomas, broken and bleeding on the floor, and then up at Penelope. She was magnificent, a goddess of vengeance forged in curves and steel. Gabriel stepped forward, placing his boot firmly on the back of Thomas's neck to keep him pinned. But his eyes never left Penelope. "You," Gabriel whispered, his voice thick with raw, unfiltered desire, "are the most dangerous thing I have ever seen." He reached out, grabbing the lapels of her Kevlar vest, and pulled her flush against his chest. The kiss was explosive. It was a collision of adrenaline power and overwhelming relief. Gabriel kissed her with a desperate, claiming intensity, his hands tangling in her wet hair, pulling her soft, solid body against his hard edges. Penny kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands gripping his broad shoulders, finally allowing the fire inside her to consume them both. They stood there in the pouring rain, surrounded by the flashing lights of the tactical vehicles and the smoke of a conquered dockyard. Penelope Hastings had walked into the underworld as a target, an invisible woman carrying the weight of society's judgments. But she was leaving it as a queen. She hadn't just survived the Mafia, she had brought it to its knees, and the king of the city was right there kneeling beside her. They say this is a man's world, a place where strength is measured in sharp angles and loud voices. They tell us that softness is a liability, that carrying extra weight makes you a target, a joke, or worse, invisible. But Penelope's story proves that true power doesn't come from a tailor-made suit or a gym-sculpted physique. True power is intellect resilience, and the sheer unstoppable force of knowing your own worth when the rest of the world tries to diminish it. She turned their prejudice into her greatest weapon, bringing a criminal empire to its knees. If this story made your heart pound, if you believe in the power of underdogs, and if you loved watching a brilliant, beautiful woman claim her crown, hit that like button. Right now, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more intense dramatic stories, where the underestimated always rise to the top.